As you can tell from my accent, and those of you who know me know that I'm not a permanent resident of Southern California. I was not born in this part of the world, in fact, and I live for at least half the year in Scotland, which is where I came from just last week, in fact, to be here for this quarter to teach this course and one or two other things. And there's quite a big difference, actually, between Scottish culture, or European culture more broadly, and American culture. As a matter of fact, there's a huge difference between American culture in terms of religious belief and just about every other country in the developed world, because you guys here have much higher levels of church attendance, connection with synagogues, mosques, and so on than anywhere else in the developed world, that's for sure. You have a much higher level of people who say, I believe in God, and in general, you are the nation who buck the trend, which is that the more sophisticated a civilization becomes, the less religious people become. And at this point in time, you don't seem to have lost that to any great extent. So that's an interesting difference between our two cultures. Where I come from, the churches are really struggling. And indeed, religious belief is really struggling, because where something like 60% of people would say, I believe in God, that translates into single-figure percentages when you ask who is actively involved in any kind of religious activity. So that the average over the whole UK for a church-going, regular church-going, which in the UK context is defined as once a month. So you can be a regular attender if you go 12 times a year. In fact, when you factor in vacation times, a regular attender probably might go 9 or 10 times a year, actually. Because if you're on vacation and you miss one of those months or two of those months, then that pushes the figures down. And on that basis of regular attenders, 6.9% of the population are regular attenders at church. Alongside that, however, in the UK, in the last census that was done, 72% of people ticked the box to say they were Christians. So you can see we have quite an interesting challenge in mission in Britain at the moment. 6% of people are regularly involved in any kind of church life, even on a once-a-month basis. 72% of people say, well, actually, I think I'm a Christian. So all sorts of interesting questions about that. I became interested in this whole question of theology and culture really arising out of work I did for a PhD some years ago. And when I was in my initial theological education, like everybody else who trains in theology, I expected that I was probably going to go and work in a church for the rest of my life, or for much of my life anyway. And I remember a chance meeting. Well, on reflection, I realized it wasn't a chance meeting because it was orchestrated by somebody who introduced me to F.F. Bruce, who was a leading scholar of a previous generation. You've probably come across some of his books in relation to biblical studies. And this individual introduced me as a fairly young student to him, and it was one of those occasions that I'll always remember because he was quite a kind of aristocratic person who did the introductions, and he invited my wife and I for a meal at his house, and it was like, well, it was like the kind of thing you see in a movie, you know, where there were so many knives and forks and silverware of every kind you could possibly imagine that you're thinking, help, what do we do here? Well, actually, somebody had told me that you always start at the outside, so I didn't get too kind of lost. But it was one of those kind of prickly conversations where you think, am I saying the right thing here, or am I supposed to be speaking? And in the course of that, F.F. Bruce, or Fred Bruce as I came to know him, said to me, he said, well, actually, he said, if you're thinking of doing a PhD, he said, maybe you could think of what we might offer you in the University of Manchester, which is where he was working at the time. So to cut a long story short, I had two options in my PhD studies. One was to go and work with a professor in Cambridge University who would have loved me to go, provided I was prepared to study like 3 words in Colossians, I think it was. Well, it might have been 3 verses, but you get the picture, some very, very sort of microscopic kind of subject matter. And the option was either that or to go with Fred Bruce, who said simply, well, hey, we'll see what we can do. So that seemed a much more viable option for me. It actually says something about who I am, because I do operate much better in open spaces than in prescribed kind of spaces. So I'm very happy to kind of hang out and see what happens, as you'll probably discover in the course of these classes. Anyway, I went there and I studied Gnosticism, which at the time seemed like a thing that happened like 1,500 years ago, you know? And I reflected on Gnosticism, I explored Gnostic texts, I learned Coptic, which was an interesting exercise in itself because the only grammar of Coptic was actually in German, so I had to brush up some German in order to learn Coptic, which is probably not the best way of doing things. But anyway, I got my PhD on Gnosticism and then thought, I've probably made it, you know. I'm going to be a New Testament scholar for the rest of my life. I'm going to be an ancient church history expert. And then suddenly out of the woodwork, as if from nowhere, I started getting these invitations from people I'd never heard of and organizations I didn't know exist, saying things like, we hear you know something about Gnostic Gospels, and we're having a seminar on the Gnostic. Would you come and lead a seminar to help us explore the Gnostic Gospels? And I remember going to the very first one of these, which was at a huge spiritual community called the Findhorn Foundation, which is in the north of Scotland. And it's one of the leading, I suppose you'd call it today, New Age communities anywhere in the world. It's actually much bigger even than any New Age communities here in California, with roughly 4,000 people through it every 12-month period. And I remember when I got there, and here were probably more people than are in this room right now, all sitting expectantly with their Coptic texts of the Gospels of Thomas and Philip and Truth and all this other stuff in front of them, having learned Coptic in their spare time, because they're all people who were doing other stuff, in order to get to the bottom of this. And, well, you've all come across the Da Vinci Code more recently. Well, the conversations we had were just like Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code, you know. How can we find the authentic Jesus? Who were Jesus' friends? Was Jesus married? Were the Gnostics the real Christians? Is there a conspiracy? All that stuff. And it dawned on me that actually here was a whole spiritual community, not just a spiritual community, a whole spiritual movement that A, I didn't know existed before that. B, was very, very serious, because how many Christians do you know who would learn Greek to get to the bottom of the New Testament? And C, Christians had not a clue how to connect with these people. And I immediately saw, even then, here was a missional opportunity. Because here were people who, unlike some of the others I knew who weren't Christians, they weren't interested in arguing about whether God existed. They knew God existed. They weren't interested in arguing about science and religion, because for them that was a peripheral side issue. They were actually saying, in order to be fully human and the best person I can be in this world, I need a spiritual connection. And they were just like open-armed and open ears and open hearts, saying, well, what is the spiritual connection that's going to make a difference to my life and help me to make sense out of it all?